June 6, 1944. 2 hours and 45 minutes in the morning. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. Andrew Michael Higgins, Jr., 17 years old. Blonde hair still disheveled from broken sleep, and hands shaking slightly from the combination of Atlantic, cold, and pure adrenaline, knelt on the dark, wet beach as he adjusted for the 23rd time the landing craft's front ramp mechanism that his father had designed, but that he, a teenager who 3 years ago had been preoccupied only with school dances and baseball games, had completely redesigned in the last 18 months. All around him, in the darkness, broken only by distant flashes of naval artillery, another 247 identical LCVP vessels bobbed on the waves, each carrying 36 soldiers whose lives depended on a landing system that had been invented, tested, failed, reinvented, and finally approved by a kid who couldn't yet legally buy beer or vote in presidential elections. The metal ramp, weighing 180 pounds of reinforced steel, was held in place by 12 hydraulic pivot points that Higgins Jr. had drawn by hand in his high school geometry notebook in New Orleans, Louisiana, using physics principles he had learned not at engineering universities, but by observing drawbridges on the Mississippi and floodgates on shrimp farms in the river delta. His teachers at Benjamin Franklin High School had been genuinely perplexed when, in May 1942, Andrew simply stopped showing up for class, replaced by an official letter from the United States War Department explaining that the student had been requested for a project of national importance, and his school credits would be awarded upon completed service. No one at the school, not even the principal, knew that the project was literally reinventing how the United States would land troops on hostile beaches, and that the person responsible for this reinvention wore braces and still had occasional pimples from teenage acne. 3 meters to his left, Sergeant Michael O'Brien, 32 years old, an 8-year infantry veteran who had participated in the North African campaign, watched the teenager with a mixture of paternal protection and not entirely dispelled disbelief. O'Brien had 3 children at home, the oldest being 14, and seeing someone just 3 years older literally holding an 8-wrench and adjusting equipment on which the lives of thousands of men would depend created a profound cognitive dissonance in him that he couldn't fully process even after 6 months of working alongside the boy. 2 years and 8 months earlier, Berlin, Germany, October 5, 1941, 11 o'clock in the morning, OTD, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Generalmajor Klaus von Rundstedt, 54, decorated veteran of the First World War and one of the chief architects of the Third Reich's coastal fortifications, leafed through with increasing amusement intelligence reports on American landing preparations intercepted by German agents in Louisiana ship. He called his deputy, Oberst Heinrich Müller, 42 years old, graduated with honors from the Prussian Military Academy, and read aloud the passages he considered particularly comical. Mr. Colonel, the Americans apparently put a 15-year-old boy, the son of a swamp boat builder, to design their invasion craft. The boy, identified as Andrew Higgins, Jr., has no formal education in marine engineering, does not attend university, and his previous experience consists of helping his father build small boats for hunting alligators in the Louisiana swamps. The intercepted plans show a primitive design, essentially a rectangular plywood box with an outboard motor and a manually operated front ramp. Muller took the technical sketches attached to the report and studied them briefly before throwing them back on the table with a dismissive gesture. Main General, this confirms everything we know about the American mentality. While we developed Atlantic Wall with Europe's best military engineers, men with decades of experience in coastal fortifications, the Americans rely on teenagers and amateurs. Our beach obstacles are specifically designed to destroy flat-bottomed vessels like these. Von Rundstedt lit a Cuban cigar, a gift from a Kriegsmarine officer recently returned from patrol, and exhaled bluish smoke as he walked to the large map of the French coast hanging on the wall. Every inch of that coast was marked with representative symbols, setting obstacles, mines, bunkers, artillery positions. Let them come with their wooden boats built by children. Our MG-42 will cut them like paper. When the first wave of invasion reaches our shores, they will discover that modern amphibious invasion requires more than youthful American enthusiasm. It requires German engineering, German discipline, German professionalism. Americans will learn this lesson with blood, Muller enthusiastically agreed. General, our own landing craft were developed by Blomu and DeVos, a shipyard with a 103-year history, using teams of engineers with an average of 22 years of formal technical education. Comparing our sternboot to these American boxers is like comparing a Panzer to a farm wagon. Von Rundstedt returned to his desk and filed the report in a folder marked low priority, never again looking at those drawings that a blonde-haired teenager had scribbled in a school notebook between algebra and world history classes. The story of how Andrew Michael Higgins Jr. arrived on that dark beach in Normandy began not with military ambition or ardent patriotism, but with a simple fishing boat that his father, Andrew Jackson, Higgins Sr., 50, built in the backyard of his makeshift workshop in a working-class neighborhood of New Orleans. It was the summer of 1939. Andrew Jr. was just 12 years old, and his main responsibility was holding tools and raking sawdust, while his father worked on custom crafts for local fishermen who navigated the complex, shallow bayous of Louisiana. Higgins Sr. had years earlier developed a unique design of a boat with a flat bottom and a raised bow that could sail in extremely shallow waters and run aground on mud banks without damage, perfect for the marshes, but absolutely unconventional for any shipbuilding manual. The boy absorbed not only carpentry techniques, but his father's fundamental philosophy. Form follows function, a concept that would be revolutionary when applied to amphibious warfare. Higgins Jr. attended Benjamin Franklin High School, was an average student in subjects such as literature and history, but demonstrated unusual aptitude in geometry, physics, and technical drawing. His teachers noticed that he solved mathematical problems not through memorized formulas, but through spatial visualization, drawing three-dimensional diagrams in the margins of his tests that showed intuitive understanding of force vectors, torsional moments, and weight distribution. In November 1940, when he was 13 years old, his father received his first visit from United States Navy officers interested in adapting Higgins' boats for military operations. Andrew Jr. was present at that meeting, sitting quietly in the corner of the office while Commander Victor Krulak, 36 years old, a graduate of explained the naval requirements. We need a vessel that can carry 36 fully equipped men, approach the beach at 8 knots of speed, and disembark everyone in less than 20 seconds. Higgins Sr. stroked his gray beard and looked at his son. "Andy, what do you think?" The boy, surprising everyone in the room, stood up and walked to the table where the officers had spread out photographs of Pacific beaches. He studied the images for perhaps 45 seconds before speaking. "The problem is not getting to the beach. The problem is to disembark without everyone getting killed while jumping off the sides of the boat. You need a front ramp." Krulak smiled fatherly. "Young man, we've already tried frontal ramps. The weight causes the bow to sink into the sand. Furthermore, creating a ramp that can support the weight of men and equipment requires complex engineering." Andrew Jr. was not discouraged. "Not if you use hydraulic counterweight and adjustable ballast distribution. Compensate for the weight of the ramp by shifting the boat's center of gravity through balancing water tanks at the stern. When the ramp falls, pumps transfer water backwards, keeping the boat level." The Navy officers exchanged looks of polite skepticism, but Higgins Sr. knew that look on his son's face. It was the same look the boy had when he was 8 years old, when he designed and built a tree house with a pulley system to lift materials on his own, or when he was 10 years old, when he redesigned the refrigeration system in his mother's warehouse using convection principles he had observed in ceiling fans in local churches. "Commander, you should let my son draw this." Krulak, to his credit, didn't laugh in their faces. "Mr. Higgins, we appreciate the enthusiasm, but developing military equipment requires qualified engineers, extensive testing, safety approvals. That's just math and physics." Andrew Jr. responds. He gave it with the absolute confidence that only teenagers possess. "I can have the drawings ready in a week." 2 months later, in January 1941, the first prototype built from Andrew Jr.'s designs was tested on Lake Pond. The boy was 14 years old, a junior in high school, and watched nervously as 36 fully equipped Marines boarded the vessel that had existed only in his imagination 7 weeks earlier. Commander Krulak, now convinced that there was something special about this skinny, blonde-haired boy, personally commanded the test. The vessel approached the lake shore. that had been prepared to simulate a landing beach. 50 feet from shore, the ramp operator, Corporal James Mitchell, 22, pulled the lever that Andrew had marked with red paint. The front ramp fell with a satisfying clang, hitting the water and immediately sliding into the shallow sand of the bank. The boat remained perfectly level. Men began to run down the ramp. Stopwatches ticked down. 18 seconds. All 36 Marines had disembarked within 80. Krulak looked at the teenager nervously chewing gum on the bank. "Mr. Higgins, your son has just done something that our best naval engineers in Washington have failed to achieve in 2 years of trying." Andrew Jr. just shrugged. A typically teenage gesture. "It was just basic physics, sir." News of the successful test traveled quickly through military channels, eventually reaching General Dwight Eisenhower, then just a colonel serving on the general staff in Washington. Eisenhower, 50 years old, a veteran of the First World War, but with no experience in direct combat, was obsessed with the problem of how the Allies could eventually land enough forces in Europe to defeat Hitler. He read the report on the Louisiana Boy 3 times. Then called an extraordinary meeting with Navy officials. "I need to understand correctly. A 14-year-old teenager solved the amphibious landing problem that has frustrated this department since night." The answer was affirmative, but hesitant. Officials explained that while the design was promising, there were still questions about durability, mass production, and operator training. Eisenhower cut the conversation short. "I don't care if the designer wears diapers. If it works, we use it. Start production immediately." In March 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, Andrew Jr. received an official letter from the War Department ordering him to report to Higgins Shipyard in New Orleans for civilian service of national importance. He was 16 years old, a junior in high school, and suddenly he was the unofficial chief engineer of a program that would produce more than 23,000 landing craft over the next 3 years. His official salary was $62 a month, the same as a private. But his real responsibility was to ensure that every LCVP coming off the production line worked exactly as he had designed. The teenager worked 16 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, often sleeping on a cot on the site itself. His co-workers were men 3, 4 times his age, carpenters and welders, with decades of experience. But they all quickly learned to respect the skinny kid who could diagnose structural problems just by looking at how a vessel rocked in the water or listening to the sound the engine made under load. Martha Higgins, his 47-year-old mother, visited the yard twice a week, bringing home-cooked food and clean clothes, watching with a mixture of maternal pride and growing concern as her youngest son transformed from a boy into something she had no words to describe. Technician Eugene Morrison, 53 years old, a 32-year veteran of shipyard work, remembered years later. "At first, we all thought, what the hell is a kid going to teach us about building boats?" But within the first week, and he identified an engine vibration issue that our senior engineers had been unable to resolve for 2 months. He designed a modification on the engine mount using a lunch napkin. We installed it, and the problem went away. After that, when Andy spoke, we listened. It didn't matter that he still had acne, or that his voice sometimes cracked when he got nervous. That kid understood boats in a way that none of us old men ever would. But the true test, the moment that would define whether one teenager's work could truly change the course of history, would come on the bloody beaches of Normandy. June 6th, 1044, 5 hours and 30 minutes in the morning. First wave of assault reaching Omaha Beach. Andrew Higgins Jr. was on the 12th boat of the first wave, not because he needed to be there, but because he had insisted on going. He was 17, technically still a civilian, and theoretically shouldn't be within 100 kilometers of a combat zone. But he had forged documents, convinced a sympathetic officer to include him as a technical observer, and now found himself crouched behind the steel front ramp as German bullets ricocheted off the metal with sounds that sounded like hail, hitting a tin roof. Corporal Richard Jonsson, 23 years old, from a wheat farm in Kansas, crouched beside him, breathing heavily. "Jesus Christ, kid, you shouldn't be here. You should be on a beach somewhere drinking soda and flirting with girls." Andrew checked the ramp release mechanisms for the last time, his hands moving with the certainty of someone who had adjusted those same mechanisms literally thousands of times. "I need to see if it works under real fire." If something goes wrong, I need to know so I can fix it on the next boats." Johnson looked at the teen with equal parts awe and terror. "You're crazy or brave or both." The vessel hit the sandy beach, engine roaring as it pushed a few more meters. The helmsman, seaman, first class, Thomas Wright, 31, shouted, "Prepare to disembark." Andrew pulled the red lever. The ramp fell. 35 men rushed out in 17 seconds, just as in the tests at Lake Pontchartrain 3 years earlier, but this time there were German MG-42 machine guns slicing through the air around them and mortar exploding in the water. Andrew was the last to leave, tripping on the ramp, falling to his knees in the freezing water of the English Channel that tasted of salt and blood. Johnson pulled him up, and they both ran across 80 yards of uncovered beach as sand exploded around them. They dived behind a barrage of check tanks that the engineer corps had partially destroyed. Andrew was soaked, shaking, terrified in a way no test or training could have prepared him for. But the ramp had worked. The boat had worked. Men had come out alive. For the next 6 hours, Andrew watched from his relatively protected position behind the barrier. As wave after wave of LCVPs landed on the beaches, he kept a small notebook, protected in a waterproof plastic bag, and meticulously recorded each boat he saw. Ramp number 63 opened 3 seconds slower. Probably the upper left hinge needs lubrication. Vessel number 128, listed to the right when disembarking. Possible uneven weight, distribution, or shell damage to the hull. Johnson, who had decided on his own that his personal mission was to keep this crazy kid alive, watched in disbelief. "We are literally being machined in. You are taking technical notes." Andrew didn't look up from his notebook. 80,000 men will land on these beaches in the next 2 days, using boats I designed. If something is wrong, I need to document it to fix it. This isn't about me. It's about all of them. 3 kilometers inland, in a hidden German command bunker behind Omaha Beach, Generalmajor Klaus von Rundstedt received increasingly alarming reports from his coastal positions. Commander after commander reported the same impossible thing. The American vessels were working perfectly. Troops disembarked in seconds, too fast for German artillery to adjust fire effectively. The very design of the frontal ramps meant that soldiers left facing the beach, already running, not jumping from the sides of the boat, where they were easy targets. Oberst, who had ridiculed a teenager's drawings 3 years earlier, was pale as he read reports. "Main General, our beach obstacles are not working. The American vessels are too light to deploy pressure mines, and their flat bottoms allow them to slide over underwater obstacles that would tear conventional boat hulls." Von Rundstedt felt for the first time that long morning the cold premonition of defeat. "Those wooden boats," we mocked. "Boats designed by a child." Muller just nodded. "General, our engineers are analyzing captured vessels. The design is rudimentary but brilliant. Laminated marine plywood, extremely cheap to produce but surprisingly durable. Simple outboard motor that any mechanic can fix. And that ramp, sir, it's a work of genius. Uses gravity, hydraulic counterweight, and simple geometry to create a system that never fails. No sophisticated electronics tied to break. There are no complex hydraulics to leak. Just basic physics applied perfectly." Von Rundstedt threw the reports on the table in impotent rage. "We were defeated by high school physics." Muller did not respond, because there was no possible answer. Outside the bunker, the noise of more LCVPs coming ashore was constant, relentless. Each vessel had 36 men. Each vessel unloaded in less than 20 seconds. The math was simple and devastating. Every 5 minutes, more than 300 Allied soldiers landed alive on beaches that were supposed to be their graves. Every hour, more than 3,600. In one day, more than 80,000. And each of these craft functioned exactly as a 12-year-old boy had imagined 5 years earlier while watching his father build fishing boats in a New Orleans backyard. At sunset on D-Day, Andrew Higgins Jr. sat in the sand of Omaha Beach, still shaking occasionally from residual adrenaline and combat shock. Johnson sat next to him, offering a canteen of water. "You saved a lot of lives today, kid. You know that, right?" Andrew watched the horizon, where hundreds of LCVPs still made trips back and forth between transport ships and beach, tireless machines of steel and wood fulfilling exactly the purpose for which they had been created. I only did math. Anyone could have done it. Johnson laughed, the sound harsh but genuinely amused. Boy, Germany's best military engineers couldn't stop those boats. Our own Navy's best engineers couldn't design anything like it before you came along. This isn't just math. It's something more. In the following weeks, as more and more beaches were taken across France, each landing using LCVPs, the truth about who had designed the vessels began to leak through the ranks. Soldiers who owed their lives to those front ramps asked who the genius was who had invented them. Officers who had initially doubted the vessel's capabilities now called them the greatest single contribution to Allied victory. And when the name Andrew Higgins was circulated, the response was invariably, "You mean old Higgins, the boat builder." No, the son, Andrew Jr. Deboy. Lieutenant Daniel McCarthy, an intelligence officer with the 1st Infantry Division, made the calculation one night in September 1944 as Allied troops approached Paris. Since more than 250,000 Allied soldiers had landed on the beaches of Normandy. Casualty statistics showed that the use of LCVPs had reduced deaths during disembarkation by approximately 70% compared to previous methods. This meant that Andrew Jr.'s design had conservatively saved 75,000 to 80,000 Allied lives. A teenager who couldn't vote, drive a car in some states, or buy alcohol in any of them had done more to win the war than many generals. McCarthy included this analysis in his official report, which eventually reached Eisenhower himself. In November 1944, now 54-year-old General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, summoned Andrew Higgins, Jr. to a personal meeting at his temporary headquarters in London. Andrew had just turned 18, finally of legal age, to officially enlist in the military. But at this point, he was considered too valuable to risk in direct combat. He walked into Eisenhower's office wearing civilian fatigues, a jacket his mother had bought for him but which was still slightly too big for his thin teenage body. Eisenhower stood up from behind his desk, walked around it, and offered his hand to the young man with an expression of genuine respect. "Mr. Higgins, please have a seat." Andrew sat nervously, not knowing whether he should salute or what. Eisenhower noticed the nervousness and smiled reassuringly. "Relax, son. You're not in trouble." Quite the opposite. He opened folder on his desk containing reports, photographs, statistics. "Mr. Higgins, my analysts estimate that your landing craft have saved between 75,000 and 80,000 Allied lives since without your LCVPs, the Normandy landings would have been considerably bloodier, possibly even impossible. You are 18 years old. Most boys your age are worried about girls and cars. You changed the course of world history." Andrew didn't know what to say. He mumbled something about just doing what was necessary, about basic physics, about his father. Eisenhower gently interrupted him. "Sir Higgins, modesty is an admirable virtue, but I also need you to understand the magnitude of what you have accomplished." Hitler built what he called the Atlantic Wall. Using the best military engineers in Europe, they spent years designing defenses that they supposed would make their beaches impregnable. You, a boy from Louisiana, who learned boat building by helping your father, defeated all those PhDs and German generals with paper, pencil, and intuitive understanding of basic physical principles. This is not luck or an accident. It's genuine applied genius. Eisenhower handed Andrew a small blue velvet box. Inside was the Medal for Civilian Merit, one of the highest decorations the American government could bestow on non-military personnel, for extraordinary contributions to the United States war effort, particularly in the development of amphibious equipment that saved tens of thousands of American lives. Andrew Michael Higgins, Jr. receives this medal with gratitude from a nation. Andrew held the medal with hands that finally stopped shaking. "General, may I ask you a question?" Eisenhower nodded. "Why didn't the Germans develop something similar? I mean, they're supposedly good at engineering." Eisenhower laughed, the sound deep and thoughtful. "That's the million-dollar question, boy. Our intelligence analysts have some theories. The Germans develop equipment from top to bottom, based on established military theory and doctrine. They start with what they believe should work, based on academic engineering principles, then try to make reality conform to theory. You did the opposite. You observed the real problem, tested practical solutions in the real world, and let the results guide your design. You built what worked, not what the books said should work. More importantly, the Germans would never have placed a teenager without formal credentials in charge of a critical military project. They would have required multiple college degrees, years of documented experience, endless bureaucratic approvals. We Americans are less tied to formal credentials. If you can do the job, we don't care if you're 16 or 60, if you have a PhD or never finished high school. This flexibility, this willingness to evaluate people by results and not by diplomas hanging on the wall, could be our greatest strategic advantage over the Germans. The official recognition was gratifying, but for Andrew, the real reward came in the months and years that followed as he received letters from soldiers whose lives had been touched by his work. First Class Thomas Bradley, 26, wrote from the military hospital in Southampton where he was recovering from wounds received on D-Day. "Mr. Higgins, I don't know if you'll know who I am, but I was in the 11th Wave at Omaha. Our LCVP took a direct hit from a mortar that killed 3 men on the bow, but the ramp still worked. We managed to get out. If we had to jump over the sides of the boat, we would all have died. I have a wife and 2 young daughters at home. I'm going to meet my daughters, see them grow up and get married, because of the boat you designed when you were my age minus 10. I can't thank someone enough for saving my life, but thank you." These letters, hundreds of them eventually, were what Andrew kept in a shoebox under his bed. Not the medals, not the newspaper clippings calling him a prodigy or a genius, but the letters from real men whose lives had been impacted by design decisions he had made while still in high school. In 1945, as the war in Europe drew to a close, Andrew was finally allowed to return to New Orleans and finish his high school education. He was 19, 3 years behind, and sat at desks with 16-year-old students. His teachers didn't know exactly how to treat him. How do you give geometry homework to someone who used geometry to save 80,000 lives? How do you teach physics to someone who has applied physics in ways that changed world history? Principal Thompson decided to simply give Andrew all the credits he needed and graduate him in a special ceremony. But Andrew refused. He wanted to attend classes. "I wanted to sit at uncomfortable desks and do trigonometry exercises and read Shakespeare." He desperately wanted to just be a normal teenager for a few months before the rest of his life began. His classmates treated him with a mixture of admiration and uncomfortable distance. How are you friends with someone who has already done more with their life at 19 than most people would do in 80 years? 17-year-old Sarah Mitchell eventually broke the ice by sitting next to him at lunch and asking directly, "Is it true that he launched those landing craft when he was my age?" Andrew munched on a peanut butter sandwich his mother had made, the same sandwich she had made for him since first grade. "And truth, you weren't scared, afraid it wouldn't work. Fear that people would die because of some of your mistakes." Andrew was quiet for a long moment. "All day, every night, I had nightmares about ramps that wouldn't open, about boats sinking, about soldiers dying because I had measured something wrong or chosen the wrong material. But doing nothing, letting the soldiers use bad boats when I knew I could do something better, that would be worse." Sarah looked at him with new understanding. "You're just a boy, like any of us. You simply had no choice to act like one." Andre smiled, his expression a little sad. "I guess no one really has a choice when history calls to you. You only decide whether to respond or not." 5 years later, in June 1955, a ceremony commemorating the 6th anniversary of D-Day was held on Omaha Beach, now peaceful and transformed into a memorial. Andrew, 23 years old, and a recent mechanical engineering graduate from MIT, where he had finally obtained formal education to complement his intuitive genius, was invited as the keynote speaker. 2,000 veterans were present, many wearing medallions and patches from divisions that had landed on that bloody beach 6 years earlier. Andrew stepped up to the makeshift podium, looked out to see where a restored LCVP swayed gently in the waves in tribute, and began to speak. "When I was 12, my father told me that good boats aren't built by people who follow rules. Good boats are built by people who understand water, wood, and physics enough to know when to break the rules." He was talking about fishing boats in Louisiana swamps, but I applied that principle to something much bigger. His voice, now deeper and firmer than the teenage tenor of 6 years ago, carried through the attentive silence. Germans built Atlantic Wall, following all established military engineering rules. They did everything right, according to traditional military doctrine, and we beat them with plywood boats designed by a boy who learned boat building by helping his father in the backyard. Not because I was smarter than German engineers. Many of them were brilliant, but because I was willing to ignore what the books said should work and build what actually did. He paused, looking at the thousands of faces in the audience. I saw many of you 6 years ago. I was on the 12th vessel of the first wave. I saw you run across that beach while machine guns were firing. I saw you jump into bomb craters and hide behind check obstacles. I saw some of you fall. Many of you don't know, but I carried a notebook that whole day, taking notes on how the boats were working, looking for anything that could improve for the next waves. He held the same notebook, now stained and faded but carefully preserved. One soldier, Corporal Richard Johnson, stayed with me all day, making sure I didn't do anything stupid and get killed. Johnson, you are here today. The man, now 29 years old, married with 2 children, stood up somewhere in the crowd. Andrew waved at him. Johnson told me that day that I had saved many lives. At the time, I couldn't really process it. I was just a terrified kid trying not to throw up from fear. But in the years since then, I've received hundreds of letters from soldiers who landed in Omaha, Utah, on Iwo Jima, on Okinawa, in the Philippines, all using boats I helped design. And the thing that amazes me, the thing that keeps me up at night in a good way, is that each of these men had a chance to go home, to see their families again, to live their lives, partially because I paid attention in high school physics class. His voice broke slightly with emotion. The lesson I want you to understand, especially you young people here today, is that age does not determine impact. Diplomas do not determine value. You don't have to wait until you're old, experienced, or fully credentialed to make a difference in the world. When I was 12 years old designing my first boat, I didn't know I was starting a project that would change history. I was just trying to solve interesting problem. When I was 16 years old, overseeing production of thousands of LCVPs, I wasn't thinking about legacy or recognition. I was just trying to make sure every weld was strong, every hinge worked smoothly, every ramp would open when soldiers needed it. He looked directly at the group of students, high school students, who had been brought in as part of the educational program. You're there. You're 16, 17, 18 years old. You are not too young to change the world. You are not too inexperienced to make important contributions. If you see a problem that needs to be solved, don't wait until you are older or more educated. Solve it now. Use what you know, learn what you don't know, and build something that works. The world needs people who do things, not people who wait for permission to do things. Andrew came down from the podium, surrounded by veterans wanting to shake his hand, hug him, introduce him to their wives and children. Each had a story about how specific LCVP had saved their life or the lives of comrades. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, now 38, an auto repair shop owner in Boston, brought his 3 sons to meet Andrew. Boys, this is the man who allowed your father to survive the war and return home so you could be born. You owe your existence to him. The boys, 8, 10, and 12 years old, looked at Andrew with wide eyes. You actually designed those boats when you were our age. I was only a few years older than you, Andrew told the older man. The 12-year-old looked at his father, then back at Andrew. I want to do something important too, something that helps people. Andrew knelt down to be at eye level with the boy. So start now. Don't wait until you're an adult. Observe the world around you. See problems that need to be solved. So learn what you need to learn and build solutions. You don't need anyone's permission to make a difference. Over the next few decades, as Andrew built a career in aerospace engineering, eventually working on the Apollo project that would put men on the moon, he always maintained a connection with the die-veteran community. He attended every annual meeting in Omaha, watching as the men aged, their numbers gradually dwindling as time did its inevitable work. In 1984, the 40th anniversary of Andrew was 57 years old, with hair beginning to gray at his temples. But he still possessed that characteristic nervous energy and ability to explain complex technical concepts in a way that anyone could understand. President Reagan was present at that ceremony and specifically requested to meet Andrew. Mr. Higgins, the president said, shaking his hand firmly. Historians tell me that your landing craft were one of the 5 most important technological contributions to Allied victory in World War II, alongside radar, the atomic bomb, the Jeep, and the Ultra codes. And you developed yours when you were still in high school. This is remarkable. Andrew, never entirely comfortable with excessive praise, shrugged. Mr. President, I did not invent any new technology. I used plywood, existing outboard engines, and physical principles that Archimedes understood 2,000 years ago. My contribution was just to apply these things in a slightly different way. Reagan laughed. Mr. Higgins, with all due respect, that modesty is exactly the kind of American attitude that won that war. Not arrogance about natural superiority, but pragmatic recognition that hard work and creative thinking can overcome any obstacle. That night, after the official ceremonies, Andrew sat alone on the dark beach, listening to waves crash on the same sand where 40 years earlier he had trembled with fear and adrenaline. Johnson, now 65, retired from his mechanics business, sat down next to him uninvited, thinking about that day. Andreu nodded, thinking about every day after. All the letters I received, all the people I met who were here because of something I did when I was old enough to drive just 2 years ago. Johnson was quiet for the moment. You know what impresses me most, Andy? It's not that you designed those boats. It's just that you never let it go to your head. You could have spent the last 40 years dining on this story, but instead you went to college, got your degree, built a real career based on continuous hard work. You treated saving 80,000 lives as just the beginning, not the culmination. Andrew smiled in the darkness. My father told me something when I was a boy. He said, Andy, no matter how good something you built is, there's always something better waiting to be built. Never stop at your first success. And I never stopped. Boats were important, but they were just applied physics. Then I wanted to do more applied physics. Hence Apollo. Hence control systems for satellites. Hence all the other things. Johnson laughed softly. You are the only guy who knows I know you can describe saving 80,000 lives as just applied physics. Andrew Michael Higgins, Jr. lived to the age of 89. Dying peacefully at his home in Huntsville, Alabama, in 19... His obituary in the New York Times took up half a page and described him as possibly the most influential young man in American military history. A boy who changed the course of World War II with a geometry notebook and an intuitive understanding of basic physical principles. His funeral in New Orleans attracted hundreds of mourners, including 3 surviving D-Day veterans, all now in their late 70s or 80s, who made a point of attending despite physical travel difficulties. Thomas Bradley, now 76, widowed and suffering from severe arthritis, traveled from Boston in a wheelchair specifically to pay his last respects. I have 5 grandchildren, he said in an impromptu eulogy. Some of them are in college now, becoming doctors and engineers and teachers. They exist because Andrew Higgins paid attention in his physics class when he was 16. Every good thing in my life, after June 6, 1944, meeting my wife, raising my children, seeing my grandchildren born, all happened because a teenager in Louisiana was smart and brave, enough to do something that the best engineers in Germany couldn't do. Andrew's son, Michael Higgins, 43 years old, a software engineer in Silicon Valley, found among his father's belongings the original notebook from 1939, the first one in which Andrew had sketched out the concept of a frontal ramp. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the drawings were still clearly visible, traced by the hand of a 12-year-old boy who had no idea he was designing a tool that would save tens of thousands of lives. In the margins of one page, in careful childish writing, Andrew had written, "Check with Dad if ramp angle is correct. Test in the lake on Saturday." Michael donated the notebook to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it is now on permanent display alongside restored LC. The explanatory plaque tells the full story, how a teenager with no formal education in naval engineering revolutionized amphibious warfare through sheer applied creativity and a willingness to ignore conventional wisdom. 15 years after Andrew's death, in June 2011, the 66th anniversary of D-Day, only 17 veterans of the first wave in Omaha were still alive. 5 of them made the trip back to Normandy for a memorial ceremony. Richard Johnson, now 91, traveled from Boston, supported by his grandson, an army captain who had served in Iraq, standing on the same beach where decades earlier he had run alongside a terrified teenager. Taking technical notes under enemy fire, Johnson gave an interview to a CNN correspondent. Reporter, young woman in her 30s, who wasn't born until 25 years after D-Day, asked the obvious question. "Mr. Johnson, what do you want people to remember about that day?" Johnson leaned heavily on his cane, eyes still clear, despite his age. "I want you to remember that impossible is just a word people use when they can't imagine how something can be done. Germans said Omaha was impregnable. They said there was no way to land enough forces quickly enough to establish a base on the beach. They were wrong because 17-year-old boy proved them wrong. He didn't prove it with theories or simulations or studies. He proved it by building something that worked." Reporter consulted his notes. "Our researchers found that the German military specifically ridiculed the LCVP's design when it intercepted plans years before D-Day. They called it primitive, inadequate, and the work of amateurs." Johnson laughed. "The sound rough, but genuine. Those amateurs saved 80,000 lives and defeated the most professional war machine Europe has ever seen. I think this says something about the value of formal credentials versus actual outcome." Andrew Higgins did not have a PhD in marine engineering. He had a geometry notebook and a willingness to try things that so-called smarter people said wouldn't work. The world needs more people like him. It needs more young people who look at problems and say, "I can solve this," rather than waiting for someone older and more credentialed to solve it for them. His grandson, watching from the sidelines, felt intense pride not just in his grandfather but in this boy he had never met, but whose work had allowed his grandfather to survive, to return home, to raise a family, to live a long life. That night, he began researching the full story of Andrew Higgins, Jr., eventually writing master's thesis on impact of young inventors on American military history. He found that while Andrew was the most dramatic example, there were dozens of other cases during World War II where people under the age of 25 had made significant technical contributions. Something about youth, a discovered about not being bound by conventional wisdom or limited by knowledge of all the reasons why something supposedly couldn't work, allowed young minds to sometimes see solutions that older, more experienced minds couldn't see. Today, in 2025, 81 years after D-Day, there are no survivors left from the first wave of assault on Omaha. Richard Johnson was the last, dying in 2019 at the age of 100. But the story of Andrew Higgins, Jr. persists, taught in high school history classes across the United States as an example of how age should not limit ambition or ability. LCVP itself has become iconic, instantly recognizable as a symbol not just of D-Day, but of American creativity and innovation. Museum in New Orleans, where Andrew's notebook is on display, receives 40,000 visitors a year, many of them high school students on school trips. Guides tell the story of how a boy not much older than them changed world history. Some students are inspired, some are skeptical. How could someone so young actually do something so important? But then they see notebook drawings, read letters from grateful soldiers, look at restored LC, and touch real steel that took real men to real beach, where some died, but many lived, specifically because teenagers had done math correctly. And some of these skeptical students leave the museum thinking differently about their own capabilities, their own possibilities. German generals who mocked Andrew's drawings never understood the fundamental truth about America that Eisenhower had articulated, that rigid hierarchical systems based on formal credentials and seniority inevitably lose out to open systems that evaluate people by actual ability and demonstrated results. Andrew Higgins, Jr. should not have been able to do what he did. He was too young, too inexperienced, too uncredentialed, but no one had told him he couldn't, so he just did it. And in doing so, he saved 80,000 lives, changed the course of the most devastating war in human history, and proved forever that genius knows no age, that creativity requires no degrees, and that sometimes the most important solutions to the most critical problems come not from established experts, but from young people who simply refuse to believe that something can't be done. Today, military engineers study Andrew's work as a classic example of functional design. overcoming unnecessary complexity. High school teachers cite him as proof that students should not underestimate their own capabilities. Historians recognize him as one of the most impactful figures of World War II, despite never having fired a shot or commanded a unit. His tombstone in a quiet cemetery in New Orleans bears the simple inscription, Andrew Michael Higgins, Jr., 1926 to 1995, he solved the problem. No mention of medals or honors, no list of achievements, just recognition that when history presented a critical problem, a 12-year-old boy looked at it and decided there was a solution, then spent the next 7 years building that solution, saving tens of thousands of lives in the process. And that, in the end, is all that really matters.